What do you do when the world you know casts you out with nothing but a worthless piece of paper and the clothes on your back? When the coming winter promises not just cold, but a final, silent end? You could surrender. You could beg. Or you could listen to the forgotten whispers in your own blood and trust the wisdom of an old, tired animal. This is a story about that choice. Stay with this story, and you will see how a tomb became a cradle. The eviction notice was as cold and gray as the November sky hanging over the quarry town of Grimspire. Ilara held the paper in her hand, the cheap ink already blurring from a fine mist that was more spirit than water. It gave her until the first true snow. After that, the company house, the one she had shared with Thomas for 12 years, would belong to another man, another family, another cog in the great stone-grinding machine of the Blackwood Quarry Company. Thomas was gone, claimed by the same silica dust that seemed to coat every surface in the town, a fine, pale powder that settled on windowsills and in the lungs of men. His passing had been quiet, a slow fading that left Ilara with a hollow space in her heart and an empty chair by the fire. The company's sympathy had been even quieter. It had lasted 1 month. Foreman Blackwood had delivered the news himself. He had not bothered to remove his hat, a hard felt thing that sat on his head like a small, dark stone. His voice was gravelly, a sound scraped from the pit itself. Company property, Ilara, for company men. You understand. He had not looked at her, his eyes fixed on some point over her shoulder, as if already seeing the next family moving in their meager belongings. He was a man made of straight lines and hard angles, a physical embodiment of the company's unyielding logic. There was no room for sentiment in his world, no space for a widow who no longer served a purpose. He had pushed a second document across the table, a deed. The company is not without heart, he'd said, the words a mockery of the sentiment. Your husband's tenure earns you this. It was a plot of land, a square drawn on a map high up on the eastern ridge, a place the townsfolk called the Boneyard. It was a wind-swept knob of slate and shale, where the wind scoured the earth clean, and only the hardiest, most twisted scrub pines could find purchase. Nothing grew there. Nothing lived there. It was a gift of nothing, a final, cruel joke dressed in the language of charity. So she had packed. There was not much to take. A few pieces of sturdy furniture Thomas had made, a trunk of her own things from a life before Grimspire, a set of iron pots, and the memories that clung to the walls like shadows. The people of the town watched her, their faces a mixture of pity and a carefully concealed relief that it was her, not them. They were all company people, living in company houses, their lives measured by the shrill blast of the quarry whistle. They knew how precarious their own footholds were. To help her was to mark oneself. To associate with the discarded was to invite the same fate. Her only companion in this exodus was Dust, a mule of indeterminate age and a temperament that hovered somewhere between stubbornness and profound patience. Dust had been Thomas's partner in the small garden they'd been allowed to keep, a patch of ground that yielded tough little potatoes and stringy beans. The mule was old, his coat the color of a faded burlap sack, his ears drooping with the weight of years. He was all that was left of their shared life, a living, breathing relic. On the final day, with a sky the color of a fresh bruise, Ilara loaded what she could onto a small cart. She led Dust out of the small yard for the last time, not looking back at the house. To look back was to invite a grief she could not afford. The road to the boneyard was not a road at all, but a steep, winding track used by hunters in a better season. It climbed away from the hollow where Grimspire sat nestled in its perpetual haze of stone dust, ascending into the cold, clear air of the high ridge. The wind was a constant presence here. It was a living thing, a restless spirit that tore at her shawl and pushed against her with invisible hands. It had a voice, a low moan that slid through the skeletal branches of the pines and across the exposed faces of slate. The sound was one of utter desolation. The ground underfoot was hard, a jarring surface of broken stone that made the cart wheels groan and Dust's hooves click with a sharp, lonely sound. They reached the plot just as the meager light began to fail. It was exactly as she had imagined, only worse. A barren crown on the ridge, exposed to the full fury of the elements. A few stunted trees clung to the edges, their branches permanently swept back in the direction of the prevailing wind, like supplicants bowing in perpetual defeat. The earth itself was a thin skin stretched over a skeleton of solid rock. Elara walked its perimeter, the deed clutched in her hand, a useless title to a kingdom of wind and stone. This was it, the end of the line, a place to die. She unhitched Dust, who stood with his head lowered, seemingly indifferent to the gale that whipped his coarse mane. She had a small canvas tent, barely enough to break the wind, and a few blankets. It would not be enough. The first snow was not a question of if, but when. The clouds on the horizon were already thickening, their bellies heavy and dark. Despair, a cold and heavy thing, settled in her chest, far colder than the wind. She sank to the ground, wrapping her arms around her knees, and watched the last of the light bleed from the sky, leaving the world in shades of black and deep, unforgiving gray. The wind howled its lonely song, and for the first time, Elara felt the utter, crushing weight of her solitude. She was a ghost on a mountain of bone, waiting for the snow to come and claim her. For 3 days, she existed in a state of paralysis. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that gnawed at her through the thin canvas of the tent. She moved only when she had to gather brittle firewood from the stunted pines, to fetch water from a trickling seep a quarter-mile down the slope. Each movement was an immense effort, a battle against the inertia of hopelessness that had taken root in her soul. She ate little, a cold biscuit of hardtack soaked in water until it was soft enough to chew. The world had shrunk to the size of her misery, a small, gray circle of suffering. Dust, the old mule, was her only anchor to the living world. He stood tethered near the tent, his resilience a silent rebuke to her despair. He seemed to draw sustenance from the very air, his quiet presence a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the howling of the wind. He would watch her with his large, dark eyes that seemed to hold a deep and ancient patience. He did not ask for much, a bit of fodder she had managed to bring, a bucket of water. He simply endured. On the third morning, the sky was different. The gray had a new weight to it, a luminous, oppressive quality that spoke of imminent snow. A few stray flakes, large and wet, drifted down, melting the moment they touched the dark stone. It was a warning, a death sentence delivered on the wind. The sight of it should have broken her. It should have been the final blow that shattered her will to live. But something else happened. She watched a single, perfect snowflake land on the back of her chapped hand. It was an intricate, impossible jewel, a fleeting masterpiece of geometry. And in that tiny, cold star, she saw not an end, but a beginning. A memory stirred, distant and warm. It was her grandfather, his hands large and calloused, smelling of earth and tobacco. He was a man from the old country, a place of high mountains and deep winters, a place where people did not fight the cold but made peace with it. He had been a stonemason, but he called himself an earth shaper. "The fools," he would say, his voice a low rumble like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. "They build their boxes of sticks to stand against the wind. The wind always wins. The wind and the cold are brothers. You do not fight them. You go where they cannot follow." The memory was a spark in the frozen landscape of her mind. It was not enough to warm her, but it was enough to make her see. She looked at the barren ground, at the unyielding slate. It was not a boneyard, it was a shield. Then, Dust did something strange. He had been pawing at the ground, a restless habit she had seen before. But this time, it was different. He was focused, persistent, scraping at the same spot on a slight incline at the center of the plot. His iron-shod hoof rang against the slate, again and again. Annoyed at first, Ilara went to lead him away. But as she reached for his bridle, she saw what he had done. He had chipped away a section of the thin, brittle slate, and beneath it was not more rock, but a dense, dark seam of something else. She knelt, her knees protesting on the cold ground. She reached down and touched the exposed substance. It was cool and slightly damp, with a smooth, plastic texture. It was clay. A thick, heavy vein of it, packed between layers of stone. Another memory, another fragment of her grandfather's wisdom, surfaced from the depths. He had been showing her a small model he had made, a miniature house carved into a lump of earth. "The earth has a slow, warm breath," he had whispered, his finger tracing a line on the model. "All year long it breathes. In the winter, its breath is warm. In the summer, its breath is cool. A wise man builds his home in the heart of the mountain, not on its skin." Ilara looked from the clay to the slope of the hill. She looked at the relentless wind tearing at the pines. She looked at the heavy, snow-laden sky. The despair that had held her in its icy grip for 3 days did not melt. It shattered. It broke apart and was replaced by something else, something cold and hard and clear. It was resolve. A fury, not of anger, but of pure, unadulterated will. She would not die here. She would not build a house to stand against the wind. She would go where the wind could not follow. She would dig. She would carve her home not on the boneyard, but from it. The slate would be her walls, the clay her mortar, and the earth itself her roof. She would build a home in the heart of the mountain. The plan that formed in her mind was not born of architectural knowledge or careful calculation. It was instinctual, a blueprint written in her blood, passed down from a man who understood the fundamental truths of survival. She would dig into the south-facing slope of the hill, the one that received the most of the meager winter sun. The entrance would be narrow, a small opening that could be easily sealed. The main living space would be a single chamber, deep within the earth, insulated by tons of stone and clay. A small flue, carefully constructed from flat pieces of slate, would snake its way to the surface for a stove. A stove she would have to build herself. She had her husband's tools: a heavy pickaxe, 2 shovels, one with a spade head, one with a square head, and a sledgehammer. They were good tools, made of solid steel and seasoned hickory. Thomas had cared for them meticulously. They were an extension of his own quiet strength. Now, they would be an extension of hers. She started that same day. The first task was to break through the surface layer of slate. She swung the pickaxe, the impact jarring her arms and shoulders. the sound a sharp crack that was immediately swallowed by the wind. The first swing barely scratched the surface. The second did little more. For hours she worked, a frantic, desperate rhythm of swing, impact, and the scraping of the shovel to clear the debris. Her breath came in ragged clouds, her muscles screamed in protest. This was not the work of a woman, the townspeople would have said. This was the work of a quarry gang. And another swing, and another. By dusk, she had created a shallow depression, a ragged wound in the skin of the hill. Her hands were raw, the skin broken and bleeding. Her back was a column of fire. She was exhausted, but it was a clean exhaustion, a feeling of righteous labor that pushed the despair to the furthest corners of her mind. She ate her meager meal not with hopelessness, but with a sense of purpose. She was not waiting to die. She was fighting to live. A week into her labor, a figure appeared on the track below. It was Foreman Blackwood, on his horse, likely making his rounds to the company's logging camps in the higher elevations. He reined in his horse at the edge of her plot, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly curdled into scorn. He watched her for a long moment, a solitary, mud-streaked figure heaving rocks from a growing hole in the ground. He did not dismount. He simply sat there, a dark silhouette against the gray sky, and laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was a harsh, grating noise, like rocks being crushed in a tumbler. "Well, I'll be," he called down to her, his voice dripping with condescension. "Digging your own grave, Alara? I have to admire the efficiency. Saves the company the trouble of burying you when the snow comes." Alara did not stop her work. She hefted another piece of slate, its sharp edges biting into her torn hands, and tossed it onto a growing pile that would become the front wall of her dwelling. She did not grant him the satisfaction of a response. Her silence seemed to irritate him more than any angry retort could have. "What is that supposed to be?" he sneered, gesturing with his riding crop at the hole. "A badger den? A root cellar for a crop you'll never grow? You've lost your mind, woman. That hole will be your tomb. A mud coffin." The words hung in the air. A mud coffin. He spurred his horse and rode on, his laughter echoing behind him. She paused, leaning on her shovel, her breath misting in the frigid air. A mud coffin. The words should have been a curse, a final nail in her own coffin. But to Alara, they were a gift. They were fuel. She looked at the dark, earthy-smelling clay, at the solid, dependable slate. He saw a grave. She saw a womb. A place of safety, of warmth, of life. She picked up her pickaxe, the handle smooth and familiar in her grip, and swung it with a renewed, ferocious energy. Let him laugh. The wind and the cold were coming, and they would be the final judges of her work. The days that followed blurred into a relentless cycle of grueling labor. Dawn would break, painting the underside of the clouds with a pale, sickly light, and Alara would already be at work. The rhythm of her life was dictated by the swing of the pickaxe, the scrape of the shovel, the grating of stone on stone. She was no longer just a woman. She was a force of nature, a human quarrying machine driven by a singular, unyielding purpose. The work was brutal. Her body, unaccustomed to such relentless physical strain, protested at every turn. In the first week, her hands were a mess of blisters that burst, wept, and then hardened into thick, leathery calluses. Her back ached with a deep, permanent fire, and her shoulders felt as if they were being pulled from their sockets. Every morning, she would wake in her cold tent, her body so stiff she could barely move. She would force herself to her feet, her joints cracking in protest, and stumble out into the biting wind to begin again. There was a strange solace in the pain. It was a clean pain, an honest pain, earned through effort. It crowded out the grief for Thomas, the bitterness of her eviction, the fear of the coming winter. Her mind, once a chaotic storm of sorrow and anxiety, became still and focused. There was only the task at hand, the next rock to be pried loose, the next shovelful of clay to be moved. The world shrank to the circle of her labor, and within that circle, she found a strange and profound peace. She was not just digging a hole, she was shaping a space. Her grandfather's words echoed in her memory, guiding her hands. She learned the language of the stone, the way the slate fractured along clean lines if struck just right with the hammer. She learned the texture of the clay, how it changed with the moisture in the air, from a slick, heavy paste to a firm, workable plaster. She became an artist, her tools the brush, the earth her canvas. The pile of excavated slate grew into a formidable wall. She began to construct the facade of her dwelling, a low, thick wall of stacked stone around the entrance to her dugout. She did not have mortar in the traditional sense, but she had something better. She mixed the heavy clay with dry grasses and her own hair, creating a fibrous, incredibly adhesive daub. She packed this mixture into the gaps between the stones, creating a seal that was not only strong, but airtight. The wind, which had been her tormentor, could find no purchase on this low, solid structure. It flowed over it, a river parting around a boulder. As she worked, she underwent a transformation. The soft lines of her face hardened, becoming more angular, more defined. The grief that had clouded her eyes was replaced by a sharp, unwavering focus. She grew thinner. The soft flesh of a townswoman burned away by labor, but her arms and shoulders became corded with muscle. She was becoming part of the landscape itself, weathered and resilient, as tough and unyielding as the stone she worked. She was no longer Ilara, the quarryman's widow. She was the woman of the boneyard, a creature of earth and stone. Her work did not go unnoticed. Occasionally, a hunter or a company logger would pass on the track below and stop to stare at the strange sight of a lone woman carving a home out of the barren hillside. They would watch for a few minutes, shake their heads in pity or disbelief, and move on. The story of the mad widow of the boneyard spread through Grimspire, a cautionary tale whispered over mugs of weak ale in the town tavern. Foreman Blackwood's cruel nickname for her project, the mud coffin, stuck. But not everyone mocked her. Silas, the owner of the general store, was a quiet, observant man with kind eyes and a face as wrinkled as a dried apple. He had known Thomas well and had always treated Ilara with a gentle respect. One day, he made the arduous journey up the track himself, leading a placid donkey laden with sacks. Ilara saw him coming and paused in her work, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a clay-caked hand. She was wary, expecting more scorn, more pity. But Silas simply dismounted and began unloading the sacks. Flour, salt, a small wheel of hard cheese, a new head for her shovel, its steel, clean and sharp. "Thought you might be running low," he said, his voice soft, almost lost in the wind. He did not look at her dwelling, did not comment on her work. He simply placed the goods on a flat stone near her tent. "I have no money to pay you, Silas," Ilara said, her own voice hoarse from disuse. Silas finished unloading and gave the donkey a fond pat on the neck. He finally turned his gaze to her, and for the first time, She saw not pity in a man's eyes, but something that looked like admiration. He looked at her calloused hands, at the determined set of her jaw, at the solid stone wall she had built. "Your credit is good with me, Ilara," he said. He nodded once, a small, profound gesture of affirmation. Then he turned and led his donkey back down the path, leaving her with the supplies and a feeling she had not known in a very long time, a glimmer of warmth in the vast, cold emptiness. It was the first crack in the wall of her isolation, a quiet vote of confidence that strengthened her resolve more than any food could. What would you do if you were Silas? Would you risk the disapproval of the powerful foreman Blackwood and the ridicule of the town to help someone everyone else had written off? Or would you play it safe, keep your head down, and let the mad widow on the hill fend for herself? Your answer says a lot about the kind of community you believe in. With renewed determination, Ilara pushed on. The structure was taking shape. The main chamber was now a deep, cave-like space, about 10 feet wide and 12 feet long. The ceiling was a natural arch of solid rock, which she reinforced with thick beams salvaged from fallen pines. The walls were a combination of exposed rock and thick layers of the clay plaster, which she smoothed with her hands until they were almost polished. The floor was packed earth, pounded until it was as hard and smooth as flagstone. Her final task was the most critical: the stove and chimney. Using the flattest, most uniform pieces of slate, she painstakingly constructed a small, efficient stove in a corner of the chamber. It was a simple design, based on her grandfather's descriptions of a Russian fireplace, built for maximum heat retention rather than a large, wasteful fire. The flue was a masterpiece of ingenuity, a narrow, rectangular channel of slate tiles sealed with clay that snaked up through the earth and rock to emerge unobtrusively on the surface of the hill, disguised as a small cairn of rocks. The day she finished, the air had a new, biting edge to it. The clouds were no longer just heavy. They were a solid, menacing ceiling of iron gray, pressing down on the world. The first true snow was coming. The wind had fallen silent, an eerie, expectant hush that was more frightening than its constant howl. She moved her few belongings from the tattered tent into the dark, earthy-smelling interior of her new home. She laid out her blankets on a raised earthen platform that would serve as her bed. She arranged her pots and her meager store of food. She brought Dust into a small, sheltered alcove she had built for him near the entrance, a space protected by the thick stone wall. Then, with a trembling hand, she lit the first fire in her stove. She used only a handful of dry twigs and a few larger pieces of wood. The flame caught, a small, bright flower of orange in the gloom. The smoke drew perfectly up the flue. There was no hiss, no sputter, just a clean, quiet burn. She closed the heavy iron door she had salvaged from a derelict mining cart and waited. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a change began to occur. The deep, penetrating chill of the earth began to recede. It was not a blast of heat like from a conventional fireplace. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to radiate from the very walls themselves. The clay and stone absorbed the heat from the small fire, holding it, turning the entire structure into a gentle thermal mass. Outside, the first flakes of the great storm began to fall. They were not the large, wet flakes of the earlier warning. These were small, dry, and dense, like grains of salt. They fell not with a drift, but with a determined, vertical purpose. Ilara stood in the doorway of her home, a solid door she had fashioned from salvaged planks, and watched the world disappear. The track, the valley, the distant shape of Grimspire, all were erased by a thickening curtain of white. She felt the sting of the wind beginning to rise again, this time with a new, vicious voice. She stepped back inside, closed the heavy door, and dropped a thick bar of wood into place. The sound of the rising storm immediately became a distant, muffled roar. The world outside could rage. The wind could tear and the snow could bury. In her mud coffin, in her badger den, in the warm, quiet heart of the earth, Alara was safe. She was home. The storm arrived not as a squall, but as an invading army. The locals would later call it the White Maw, a blizzard of such ferocity it passed from weather into legend. It began with the wind, a low growl that escalated into a shrieking, demonic howl that scoured the landscape. It tore at the poorly built company houses of Grimspire, finding every crack, every loose board, every poorly fitted window frame. It ripped shingles from roofs and shattered panes of glass with gusts that felt solid, like the blow of an invisible fist. Then came the snow. It did not fall. It flew, horizontally, a blinding, choking torrent of ice crystals that buried the world in minutes. The air grew thick with it, erasing all landmarks, reducing visibility to a few feet. To be caught outside was a death sentence. The world became a maelstrom of white noise and unimaginable cold. Down in Grimspire, panic set in. The town was a collection of identical wooden houses, built quickly and cheaply by the company. They were designed for mild weather, not for a siege. The thin walls offered little resistance to the biting cold. Families huddled around their cast-iron stoves, feeding them a constant diet of firewood. The wood piles, which had seemed so robust just days before, dwindled with alarming speed. Foreman Blackwood, secure in his own larger, better-built house, initially dismissed the concerns. "It's a squall! It will pass!" he had declared. But as the first day bled into a second, and the storm only intensified, his confidence began to crack. The temperature plummeted to depths no one could remember. Water pipes in the houses froze solid, then burst, encasing rooms in surreal sculptures of ice. The fine coal dust that coated the town now mixed with the snow, turning the drifts into a foul gray slush. By the third day, the town was in a state of crisis. Most families had exhausted their firewood. The cold was no longer just uncomfortable, it was lethal. People were burning furniture, books, anything that would catch a flame. But the heat was immediately sucked away by the ravenous wind. The first death was an elderly man, his heart giving out as he tried to chop up his own bed frame for fuel. A grim procession of half-frozen figures made their way through the blinding snow to the town hall, the only stone building in Grimspire. They huddled together in the main chamber, their breath pluming in the frigid air, their faces etched with fear. Blackwood tried to maintain order, but his authority was as frozen as the pipes in his house. His pronouncements of company efficiency and modern construction sounded like hollow lies in the face of the storm's overwhelming reality. The people looked at him with a new, cold anger. Their cheap, identical houses were not shelters. They were traps. Meanwhile, 300 feet above them on the Boneyard Ridge, Alara sat in quiet contemplation. Inside her dwelling, the storm was a distant rumor. The shrieking of the wind was a low, bass hum, the sound of a giant sleeping beast far away. The tons of earth and rock that surrounded her were a perfect sound barrier, a perfect insulator. The world outside had ceased to exist. Her reality was the small, circular space of her home. The warmth was profound. It was a gentle, even heat that radiated from the floor, the walls, the very air. Her small, efficient stove required a minuscule amount of fuel. A few logs of dense pine, harvested from the deadfall on the ridge, would smolder for hours, their heat absorbed and stored by the massive thermal battery of the surrounding earth. She kept the fire low, a bed of glowing embers that was more than sufficient. While the townspeople below burned through their life's possessions in a desperate fight for warmth, Elara was comfortable in a simple woolen shirt. She had light from a small tallow lamp, its flame a steady golden teardrop in the calm air. She had food, the flour and cheese from Silas, supplemented by her own small stores of dried beans and salted meat. She had water from a bucket of snow she brought inside, which melted slowly by the stove. She even had company. Dust, the old mule, was snug in his alcove, his slow, rhythmic breathing a comforting presence in the silence. He was warmer and safer than he had ever been in his long life. The days passed in a peaceful, methodical routine. She would wake, not to the jarring cold, but to the gentle warmth of her home. She would tend the fire, eat a slow, deliberate meal, and then work on small tasks. She mended her clothes, her fingers nimble and sure. She carved a set of wooden utensils from a piece of scrap pine, the soft scrape of the knife the only sound. She would talk to Dust, her voice low, telling him stories of her grandfather, recounting the memories that had saved her life. She was not fighting the storm. She was not enduring it. She was, for all intents and purposes, ignoring it. She had not built a fortress to withstand a siege. She had simply removed herself from the battlefield. Her grandfather's wisdom had been so simple, yet so profound. The conventional houses of Grimspire were engaged in a constant, losing battle with the elements, bleeding heat at every moment. Her home was in a state of equilibrium with the earth, hoarding its precious warmth, keeping the cold at a distance not by force, but by simple, intelligent design. She thought of the townspeople below, of their scorn, of Blackwood's cruel laughter. She felt no triumph, no smug satisfaction. There was only a deep, quiet sadness for their foolishness, for a world that had forgotten how to listen to the earth, a world that valued the straight, cheap lines of a wooden box over the gentle, enduring curve of a burrow. On the fifth day, the wind finally began to subside. The constant, high-pitched scream dropped to a mournful sigh, and then, at last, to a profound, ringing silence. The snow stopped. The white maw had passed. Elara waited another full day, letting the world settle. Then, she lifted the bar from her door and pushed. It would not budge. She pushed harder, her shoulder pressed against the wood. It gave way with a scraping groan, revealing a wall of solid, packed snow. She took her shovel and began to dig her way out into the new world. The storm lasted 6 days. When it finally broke, the sun that rose did so on a landscape transformed, a world buried and broken. Grimspire looked like a battlefield after a devastating defeat. The snow was piled in monstrous drifts, some as high as the houses themselves, sculpted by the wind into fantastic, threatening shapes. The gray slush had frozen into a treacherous, uneven sheet of ice. The silence was absolute, broken only by the mournful drip of melting icicles and the distant crack of a tree branch surrendering to the weight of the snow. The survivors emerged from the town hall like ghosts, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollowed out by fear and cold. They stumbled through the deep snow back to their homes, only to find them ruined. Walls of ice stood where furniture had been, Possessions were frozen into solid blocks. The cheap wooden houses that had been their pride were now little more than frozen, uninhabitable shells. Foreman Blackwood's house had fared little better. A section of the roof had collapsed under the snow, and his fine furniture was covered in a thick layer of icy powder. His authority had collapsed, along with his roof. The townspeople looked at him, not with respect, but with a simmering, open contempt. His blustering assurances about company quality now tasted like ash in their mouths. It was Silas who thought of Alara first. Amidst the chaos and despair, the image of the lone woman on the hill rose in his mind. Guilt gnawed at him. He had given her a few supplies, a gesture, but he had left her there. No one could have survived on that exposed ridge, he thought. Not in that storm. The others had scoffed at her, called her mad. Now, their own sanity seemed questionable. "We have to go up there," Silas said to a small group of men, his voice raspy. "We have to see." Blackwood overheard him and let out a harsh, joyless laugh. "See what? A frozen corpse in a hole? She dug her own grave. I told her as much. The woman was insane." But he decided to go along. He wanted to be there, to be proven right, to reclaim some small piece of his shattered authority by pointing to the predictable, tragic end of her foolishness. The journey up the track was a brutal ordeal. The men, weakened by days of cold and hunger, struggled through waist-deep snow. The familiar path was gone, buried under a sea of white. They navigated by memory, pulling themselves up the slope, their breath coming in painful, ragged bursts. When they finally reached the boneyard, they stopped, breathless. The scene was one of utter desolation. The entire ridge was buried under a massive drift. The stunted pines were encased in ice, their branches drooping to the ground. Of Alara's tent, of her meager campsite, there was no sign. It had been swept away, erased from existence. "See?" Blackwood said, a note of grim triumph in his voice. "Gone! The wind would have torn her to pieces before the snow even buried her." But Silas was scanning the landscape, his eyes searching. He saw the small cairn of rocks, the top of her hidden chimney, peeking out from the snow, a faint, almost invisible wisp of heat haze shimmering above it. And then he saw it, the top of her stacked slate wall, a dark line in the endless white. The entrance was completely buried. "There," Silas pointed. "Dig there." The men, fueled by a morbid curiosity, began to shovel. The snow was dense and heavy, packed hard by the wind. It was slow, exhausting work. Blackwood stood back, his arms crossed, a cynical smirk on his face. "Wasting your energy," he muttered. "You'll find nothing but a block of ice." After nearly an hour of digging, the shovel of one of the men struck wood. They had found the door. They cleared the snow away from it, revealing the heavy, solid planks. It was sealed tight. "Frozen shut," Blackwood declared. "She's in there all right, a body in a box. Just as I said, the mud coffin." Silas stepped forward and knocked on the door. The sound was a dull, flat thud in the profound silence. They waited. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time. From inside, they heard a scraping sound, the sound of a wooden bar being lifted. The door creaked open a few inches. A wave of gentle, breathable warmth washed over them, a stark and shocking contrast to the biting cold of the outside world. It was not the dry, scorching heat of a stove, but a soft, humid warmth that smelled of earth and smoke and something alive. Alara stood in the opening. She was not a frozen corpse. She was not even shivering. She was dressed in a simple shirt, her hair tied back, her face calm. Her eyes, clear and steady, met theirs. Behind her, in the soft glow of a lamp, They could see the clean, curved walls of her home. They saw the old mule, Dust, lift his head and blink slowly at them. The scene was one of impossible, unbelievable peace. The men stared, their mouths agape. They stood in a frozen hell, their own homes destroyed, their bodies aching with cold. And here was this woman, this mad widow, not just surviving, but living in a state of serene comfort they could barely comprehend. It was Blackwood who broke the silence. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of utter, slack-jawed disbelief. He stammered, the word a clumsy, broken thing. How? Alara looked at him, and for the first time he saw not a madwoman, not a victim, but a figure of immense, quiet power. Her voice, when she spoke, was not triumphant or angry. It was as calm and steady as her gaze, filled with a knowledge that felt ancient and unshakable. "You build to fight the wind," she said, her words clear and precise in the still air. "My grandfather taught me to build with the earth. You burn wood to make heat. I just keep the warmth that is already here." She did not need to say anything more. The simple truth of her words, combined with the undeniable evidence of their own senses, was a more damning indictment of Blackwood's entire worldview than any tirade could ever be. His modern methods, his company efficiency, his arrogant dismissal of the old ways, it all lay shattered at his feet, as broken and useless as the frozen houses in the valley below. The men looked from the impossible warmth of Alara's home to the face of their foreman, and they saw him for what he was: a fool. A dangerous, confident fool whose arrogance had almost cost them everything. His downfall was complete, not with a shout, but with a simple, quiet question he could not answer. The story of Alara's survival spread through the ruins of Grimspire like a wildfire. It was a tale of impossible defiance, a legend born from the heart of the great storm. The men who had been on the ridge described the scene with a sense of awe, their words painting a picture of a sanctuary of warmth and life carved from the frozen, dead mountain. Foreman Blackwood, stripped of his authority and credibility, became a pariah. The whispers of the townspeople turned from mockery of Alara to open hatred for him. Within a week, the Blackwood Quarry Company, facing a full-blown rebellion from its workforce, quietly recalled him. He left on the first sleigh out of the valley, a disgraced man swallowed by the very winter he had failed to respect. His departure left a vacuum, but not one of chaos. It was filled with a desperate, humble hope. The people of Grimspire, their homes destroyed, their faith in conventional wisdom shattered, turned their eyes to the hill. They began to make the arduous journey up the track, not in a single group, but in small, hesitant family units. They came not to mock or to stare, but to ask. Alara received them with a quiet grace. She saw the desperation in their eyes, the hollowed-out look of people who had lost everything. They crowded around the entrance to her dwelling, marveling at its simple genius, at the way the slate walls felt not cold, but alive with a retained warmth. They asked her questions, their voices tentative, respectful. How did she stack the stone? How did she mix the clay? How did she build the stove that used so little wood? She became their teacher. She took no payment, sought no position of power. She simply shared what her grandfather had taught her. She showed them how to read the land, to find the seams of clay hidden beneath the slate. She taught them how to dig into the south-facing slopes, to use the earth itself as an ally. She demonstrated the patient, methodical work of fitting the stone and sealing it with the clay daub. She explained the principles of the thermal mass, of storing heat rather than constantly creating it. The work of rebuilding Grimspire began. But they were not rebuilding the same town. The flimsy wooden boxes were abandoned, their frozen timbers salvaged for roof beams and doors. The people began to dig. All along the slopes of the valley, new homes began to take shape. Dwellings that resembled Ilara's, each one unique to the contour of the land it was built into. It was slow, back-breaking work, but it was hopeful work. It was a communal effort, neighbors helping neighbors, sharing tools and labor, their shared hardship forging a bond stronger than any company loyalty. The town was reborn. The new Grimspire was a different place, a settlement that seemed to grow organically from the earth. The houses, with their low-slung stone facades and earth-covered roofs, were almost invisible in the summer, covered in wildflowers and grasses. In the winter, they were snug and secure, mounds of snow-covered earth that kept their inhabitants safe and warm with minimal fuel. The town was no longer fighting the mountain. It was a part of it. They had learned resilience. They had learned to listen. Years passed. Ilara never moved from her home on the boneyard. It became a landmark, a place of pilgrimage. The mud coffin was now known as the Heartstone House, the place where the new Grimspire had been born. She remained a respected elder, a quiet matriarch whose wisdom was sought on all matters, from building to planting to healing. She never married again, but she was never alone. She was the grandmother to an entire town, her legacy written in the very stones of their homes. On a warm summer evening, many years later, Ilara sat on a stone bench outside her doorway. She was an old woman now, her hair as white as the winter snow, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles. She watched the children of Grimspire, the third generation born since the White Maw, playing on the hillside. They were strong, healthy children, with a deep, instinctual respect for the natural world. They played among the earth houses, their laughter echoing in the clear mountain air. Dust, the old mule, had lived out his final years in peace and warmth, and was buried in a place of honor near the house he had helped discover. Ilara looked out over the transformed valley, at the community that had risen from the ashes of its own folly, and she felt a profound sense of peace. The world is full of discarded things, forgotten knowledge, overlooked people, barren plots of land. We are often taught to value what is new, what is fast, what is built to dominate. But true strength, true resilience, often lies in what has been forgotten. It lies in the quiet wisdom of the earth, in the patience of stone, in the simple, profound truth that it is better to bend with the wind than to break against it. The greatest treasures are not always the ones that shine the brightest, but the ones buried deep, waiting for a desperate hand to uncover them and a wise heart to understand their true worth.